On the morning of February 13th, 1258, a man walked out of the greatest city on earth. He did not ride a horse. He did not carry a sword. He walked on foot, slowly, deliberately, as if every step carried the weight of centuries. His name was Almustazim Billah, the last caliph of Baghdad, the symbolic leader of the Muslim world, heir to a dynasty that had ruled for nearly 500 years. Behind him stood Baghdad, a city of more than 1 million people, a city of libraries, hospitals, schools, markets, a city whose name had once meant knowledge itself. Now it was silent. 2 weeks of siege had reduced its outer walls to broken stone. Smoke drifted through the streets. Fires still burned in distant quarters. The sound of crying had faded into exhaustion. Those who remained alive waited behind the gates, starving, terrified, listening for news that would decide whether they would live another day. Ahead of Al-Musta'sim stood the camp of the Mongols, stretching to the horizon like a second city made of felt and iron. At its center waited Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, commander of an army that had erased every city foolish enough to resist it. Al-Musta'sim was not walking to negotiate power. He was walking to beg. Witnesses later said that when he reached Hulag's tent, the caliph wept. He offered treasure beyond counting gold, jewels, silks, the accumulated wealth of 5 centuries of Abbasid rule. He begged for the lives of his people. He reminded Hulagu that Baghdad was sacred, that it was the heart of Islam, that destroying it would invite divine punishment. Hulagu listened and smiled, because this moment had never been about treasure or religion or diplomacy. It was about submission. The Mongols did not measure cities by their beauty or their knowledge. They measured them by obedience. Cities that surrendered lived. Cities that hesitated died. Baghdad had hesitated, and hesitation, to the Mongols' resistance, as Al-Musta'sim knelt in the dust before the Mongol throne. The fate of Baghdad was already sealed. To understand what was about to be lost, you must understand what Baghdad was. 5 centuries earlier, this city had not existed at all. It had been built deliberately, intentionally, as the capital of a new world. From its earliest days, Baghdad had been more than a seat of power. It was a meeting point of civilizations. Trade routes from China, India, Persia, Africa, and Europe converged here. Goods flowed in. Ideas flowed faster. Paper arrived from China and transformed everything. Books multiplied. Libraries grew. Knowledge became abundant, portable, alive. Generations of rulers invested not just in armies, but in learning. Scholars were protected, translators were paid. Physicians experimented, astronomers observed, mathematicians calculated. Philosophers argued for centuries. Baghdad had been the place where humanity tried to understand itself, while much of Europe fractured and forgot. Baghdad remembered. It preserved Greek philosophy when it vanished elsewhere. It absorbed Indian mathematics. It refined Persian medicine. It questioned, tested, corrected, and expanded what it inherited. The world would later call this period the Islamic Golden Age, but to the people living inside it, it was simply life, and now it was ending. Hulagu had not marched thousands of miles to rule from Baghdad. He had come to break it. His army was the largest the Mongol Empire had ever assembled for a single campaign, more than 100,000 warriors, supported by Chinese engineers whose siege machines could tear open any wall humanity had ever built. Cities that resisted him no longer existed. Samarkand, Bukhara.Nishapur. Each one had believed itself important. Each one had been erased. Baghdad was not different. When the caliph rose from the ground, Hulagu treated him with courtesy. He offered food and drink. He asked polite questions about the city's wealth, its hidden vaults, its treasures. Al-Mustasim answered everything. He believed, even now, that obedience might still save his people. It would not, within hours. The order was given, Baghdad would be emptied. And what followed over the next 7 days would become one of the most complete acts of destruction in recorded history. So many people would be killed that the Tigris River would run red with blood. So many books would be destroyed that the water would turn black with ink. A civilization that took 500 years to build would be undone in 13 days. And humanity would never fully recover what was lost. But the fall of Baghdad did not begin with fire. It began much earlier, with choices, with neglect, with the slow decay of power hidden behind tradition and ceremony. To see that, we must go back long before the Mongols arrived, to the moment Baghdad was born from nothing. 5 centuries before the Mongols arrived, Baghdad did not exist. There was no city, no walls, no domes rising above the river. Only flat land on the western bank of the Tigris River, baked by the sun and ignored by travelers. Caravans passed through without stopping. Merchants preferred older cities, north and south. Nothing here hinted at destiny. Then, in the year 762, a ruler arrived and decided that emptiness was an opportunity. His name was Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. His family had just seized power in a bloody revolution that toppled the Umayyads. The empire was his, but legitimacy was not. Damascus carried the memory of his enemies. Al-Mansur needed a capital that owed nothing to the past, a city that would announce a new order to the world. So he chose this place, between the rivers, not for beauty, for position. To the east lay Persia and Central Asia, routes leading toward India and China. To the west lay the Mediterranean. To the south, Arabia and Africa. To the north, Anatolia. Whoever controlled this crossing controlled trade, movement, and ideas across continents. Al-Mansur understood that power followed flow. He did not build. Slowly, he commanded an entire city into existence. Workers arrived by the tens of thousands. Bricks were fired. Timber floated downriver. Stone was hauled from distant quarries. The plan was radical. A perfect circle, nearly 2 miles across, enclosed by massive walls. 3 rings of fortification rose one behind the other. Towers punctuated the stone at regular intervals. A deep moat, fed by the river, wrapped the city in water. 4 gates cut through the walls, aligned with a compass. Each gate faced a different world. Each gate promised connection. At the exact center stood the palace and the great mosque. Above the palace rose a green dome, visible from miles away, crowned by a golden figure that turned with the wind. Anyone approaching understood the message without being told. The world led inward. And at the center sat authority. Al-Mansur named the city Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace. Peace did not mean quiet. It meant order under control. Within a generation, the circle could no longer contain what it had created. Neighborhoods spilled beyond the walls. Markets stretched along both banks of the river. Bridges of boats linked districts that could be rearranged as needed. The city breathed, expanded. People came because opportunity lived here. By the early 9th century, the population surged past 1 million. No city in Europe would match that scale for centuries. The streets filled with languages, fabrics, smells, arguments, bargains. Silk from China brushed against wool from Europe. Spices from India mixed with dates from Arabia. Ivory from Africa changed hands beside glass from Byzantium. And everywhere. Books. Paper changed the rhythm of the city. It was cheap. It was durable. It multiplied words the way grain multiplied bread. Copyists worked in rows. Bookstalls lined entire streets. Reading became common, not precious. Ideas moved quickly because they could be carried cheaply. Private collectors competed to build libraries that dwarfed royal treasuries elsewhere. Wealthy patrons paid scholars to read, write, translate, argue. Knowledge became currency, status, ambition. The river carried more than water. It carried people and thoughts. Barges drifted past, loaded with grain and manuscripts alike. At night, lamps glowed from study halls. Arguments spilled from courtyards into streets. The city did not sleep easily because curiosity does not rest. Generations grew up knowing this as normal. A child could hear debates in the mosque, watch physicians argue over treatments, see astronomers measure shadows at noon. A merchant could fund a school. A ruler could earn prestige by protecting a scholar rather than conquering a neighbor. The city learned how to absorb difference without dissolving. Greek thought entered and was challenged. Indian numbers arrived and were refined. Persian medicine was tested and improved. Nothing was accepted untouched. Nothing was rejected unread. This did not happen by accident. It happened because the city had been designed to pull the world inward. But cities, like people, change. Time introduced habits. Habits softened urgency. Power learned to rely on ceremony. Authority drifted from hands to symbols. The walls still stood. The library still grew. The river still flowed, and far away, beyond the eastern mountains, another rhythm was forming, one that valued speed over debate, obedience over learning, movement over memory. When that rhythm finally reached the rivers, it would not pause to admire what had been built. It would only ask one question, and the answer would decide everything. When Baghdad had finished pulling the world toward itself, something strange happened. The city did not drown in what it collected. It began to transform it. Scrolls arrived in languages most people in the streets could not read. Greek, Syriac, Sanskrit, Pahlavi. They came from monasteries, ruined cities, distant courts, forgotten libraries. Some were damaged, some contradicted each other. Many were wrong. Baghdad did not care. It wanted them all. Inside the city, rooms filled with paper. Shelves climbed walls. Tables disappeared under stacks of manuscripts. Lamps burned late into the night. Voices argued. Pens scratched. Errors were crossed out. Margins filled with notes at the center. Of this storm stood a single institution, the House of Wisdom. It did not announce itself with monuments. It announced itself with work. Translators labored in shifts, rendering ancient texts into Arabic line by line. A sentence from Aristotle would pass through several hands before it was trusted. Medical treatises were checked against real patients. Astronomical claims were tested by observation. Mathematics was not admired, it was used. The caliph who expanded this place understood something rare for a ruler. Armies could conquer land, but knowledge could conquer time. He paid scholars generously. He protected them fiercely. He cared little where they came from or how they prayed, only whether their work held up under scrutiny. A Christian scholar might translate a Greek text. A Jewish mathematician might correct it. A Muslim astronomer might test it against the sky. The manuscript would emerge altered, stronger. Something new. This was not preservation. It was evolution. A Persian scholar working in these rooms would give the world algebra, turning problem-solving into a system that could be taught, repeated, expanded. Another would reshape medicine into a discipline grounded in diagnosis rather than ritual. Astronomers would redraw the heavens, correcting ancient errors and naming stars that would still carry their words centuries later. Outside, the city absorbed. The results: hospitals trained physicians by practice, not tradition. Students debated logic in courtyards. Instruments were built, refined, rebuilt. Observations were recorded year after year, not to prove scripture, but to understand motion. Like matter, the river kept flowing. So did ideas. for generations. This felt permanent. A scholar entering Baghdad could assume the libraries would be there when he died. A teacher could expect his students to surpass him. A ruler could believe the city's prestige was unassailable. That assumption was the most dangerous thing of all. Time did what it always does. It softened edges. Power shifted away from the caliph's hands. Military control slipped to generals, then to factions. The ruler in the palace remained sacred, but increasingly ceremonial. Decisions were delayed. Warnings were filtered. Comfort replaced urgency. The institutions remained. The habits remained. The belief that Baghdad was untouchable settled into the bones of the city beyond the eastern horizon. The world was changing faster. A people who did not build cities were mastering movement. A culture that did not write books was perfecting coordination. They learned to live lightly, strike quickly, adapt relentlessly. They valued obedience over debate, action over memory. When they encountered cities, they tested them once. Those that surrendered lived. Those that resisted disappeared. Stories traveled west with refugees and traders. Cities fell. Entire populations vanished. Names that had stood for centuries became cautions whispered in markets. Baghdad heard these stories and waited. The libraries were still full. The hospitals still worked. The river still fed the city. No enemy had ever breached its walls. No conqueror had ever dared to touch the seat of the caliph. It was easy to believe that what had survived for 500 years would survive one more generation. Inside the House of Wisdom, scholars continued their work. New manuscripts were copied. Old arguments resumed. Lamps still burned late. No one was assigned to defend paper from fire. No one imagined that knowledge itself might become a casualty. The city had been built to pull the world inward. It had succeeded so completely that it forgot to watch the edges. When the first Mongol scouts appeared far to the east, they were not greeted as the end of an age. They were greeted as another rumor, another distant threat, another problem for later. Later would never come, because when the Mongols finally reached the rivers, they would not see a miracle of human cooperation. They would not see 5 centuries of accumulated thought. They would see walls, and walls were meant to fall. The lamps inside the libraries would keep burning, right up until the moment the stones began to fly. By the middle of the 13th century, Baghdad still looked powerful from the outside. The domes still caught the sun. The markets still hummed. The river still carried grain and books. Travelers arriving for the first time saw wealth, order, and confidence. They did not see decay. Decay is quiet. It hides behind ceremony. Inside the palace, the caliph still wore black robes. His name was spoken in Friday prayers from Spain to India. Coins still carried his titles. On paper, nothing had changed. In reality, almost everything had. The caliph no longer commanded armies. He did not appoint generals who obeyed him out of loyalty. Military power belonged to others now, men who ruled not because of bloodlines or sacred descent, but because they controlled soldiers. These soldiers were not Arabs tied to the land. They were Turks, purchased young, trained for war, raised to obey commanders rather than caliphs. They had been brought in to solve a problem centuries earlier. Abbasid rulers had feared their own armies. Tribal loyalties shifted. Generals grew. Ambitious rebellions followed. The solution seemed simple: by soldiers with no local ties. Men who owed everything to the state. It worked briefly. Then the soldiers became indispensable. Then they became powerful. Then they became untouchable. Caliphs began to rise and fall at their pleasure. Some were blinded, some were imprisoned. Some were killed quietly. The office remained sacred, but the man holding it became replaceable. Baghdad adjusted. It always had. New dynasties arrived not as conquerors, but as protectors. Persian. Rulers took control while keeping the caliph as a figurehead. Later, Turkish dynasties replaced them. Titles changed. Flags changed. The caliph stayed in his palace, blessing decisions made by others. The city learned to live with this contradiction. Absolute spiritual authority paired with near-total political weakness. For a long time, did not matter. The world still came. To Baghdad. Knowledge still flowed. Money still arrived. The institutions kept working because habit is powerful. A machine can keep running even after its engine begins to fail. But cracks spread slowly. The caliph stopped investing aggressively. In learning, patronage thinned. Decisions stalled behind layers of advisors protecting their own positions. Warnings were softened before reaching the throne. Bad news arrived, late or not at all. Beyond the palace, the wider Islamic world fractured. Egypt went its own way. Persia splintered. Central Asia slipped beyond influence. Rival rulers fought each other more often than they cooperated. Alliances were temporary. Trust was rare. Baghdad remained the symbol everyone invoked. Tanned the city, everyone assumed someone else would defend. When news arrived of cities in the east falling to a new enemy, the reaction was muted. Those cities were far away, different lands, different problems. The Mongols had destroyed entire kingdoms before. That was known. But Baghdad had survived crusaders. It had survived internal revolts. It had survived centuries of intrigue. The walls were strong. The river was wide. The name itself felt like armor, and so warnings became background noise. Envoys came from the east, describing armies that moved faster than thought. Cities erased for resisting. Populations slaughtered to make examples. These reports were discussed, debated, and filed away. Some advisors urged preparation. Others counseled patience. Gifts could be sent. Diplomacy could buy time. After all, many storms had passed before. Time, it was believed, was always available. But the Mongols did not operate on Baghdad's sense of time. While the court debated tone and protocol, roads were mapped, supply lines were planned. Engineers were gathered from across Asia. Siege machines were built in advance, disassembled, and prepared for transport. The Mongols did not wait to see what would happen. They prepared for what they intended to do. As their power rolled westward, city after city made calculations. Some surrendered early and survived. Others hesitated and vanished. The pattern was consistent, brutal, and widely known. Baghdad watched. The caliph at this moment was al-Mustassim Billah. He had not been raised to rule in crisis. He loved calligraphy. He collected books. He kept birds and spent hours watching them circle the palace courtyards. He trusted advisors who told him what he wanted to hear. He believed the city sacred. Status mattered. He believed negotiation could always continue. He believed the Mongols would not dare touch the seat of the caliph beyond the eastern mountains. A different belief had taken hold. The Mongols believed that fear was more efficient than mercy. That examples saved lives in the long run. That destroying one city completely prevented 10 more rebellions later. And now, the path to Baghdad lay open. When the first Mongol forces entered Persia in strength, it was no longer a rumor. Cities fell in weeks. Fortresses thought impregnable collapsed. Refugees poured west, carrying stories that sounded exaggerated because the truth was too large to accept. Baghdad still did not mobilize fully. The army was smaller than it appeared on paper. The treasury was thinner than it looked in ceremony. Kalas were distracted. No united defense formed by the time the Mongol vanguard crossed the mountains. The decisions that might have mattered were already years overdue. The city stood as it always had, confident. It's beautiful, unprepared. And the force moving toward it did not care what Baghdad had been, only what it would do next. The Mongols did not appear suddenly. They arrived the way winter arrives in the mountains, slowly, inevitably, and with preparation no city could see. From a distance far to the east, beyond Persia, the world had already learned their rhythm. Kingdoms that once measured power in walls and titles discovered that none of it mattered against an army that moved faster than fear. The Mongols did not rush. They planned years ahead. Roads were scouted long before armies moved. Rivers were. Measured pastures were mapped. Nothing was left to improvisation. When Hulagu Khan received his orders, the decision had already been made at the highest level of the Mongol Empire. Baghdad was not a possibility. It was an objective. Hulagu was not a raider. He was not a gambler. He was an administrator of destruction. His task was simple: remove every power west of Central Asia that might resist Mongol authority. The list was short and precise. It included Persia, it included Syria, and it included Baghdad. He spent 2 full years preparing. The army he assembled was larger than any the Mongols had deployed in a single campaign. Tens of thousands of mounted warriors formed its corpsmen who had lived on horseback since childhood, who could shoot accurately at full gallop, who could ride for days with minimal food. They were joined by allies and conscripts from conquered lands: Armenians, Georgians, Persians, Turks. Most dangerous of all were the engineers. From China came specialists who understood siege warfare as calculation, not bravery. They brought counterweight trebuchets capable of shattering stone walls from hundreds of yards away. They brought incendiary weapons. They brought tunneling techniques that could undermine the strongest foundations. Cities that had survived centuries of warfare collapsed in weeks. When these machines were deployed, the Mongols had learned a lesson the world had not yet accepted. Walls were no longer protection. Before turning toward Baghdad, Hulagu cleared. The path in the mountains of northern Persia stood fortresses that had terrified rulers for generations. The assassins, masters of infiltration and targeted killing, had survived every attempt to destroy them. Their stronghold at Alamat was considered untouchable, perched on sheer rock, supplied by hidden routes, defended by fanatics who welcomed death. Hulagu took it in weeks. The engineers built where no one believed building was possible. Stones flew where none had ever reached. When the walls cracked, the legend ended. The assassins were exterminated. Their leader was executed. Their fortresses were leveled. The message was unmistakable. If Alamat could fall, nothing could stand. The news reached Baghdad like a delayed echo. It was discussed in the palace. It was weighed. It was explained away. Advisors spoke of distance, of difficulty, of diplomacy. The Mongols were far. Baghdad was sacred. Time remained. Time was exactly what Hulagu had already taken. By the time the Mongol army began its westward march in earnest, the campaign was already decided. Supply lines stretched back across Persia. Relay riders ensured constant communication. Each column knew where it would meet the others months in advance. The advance moved in multiple directions at once. One force swept through the north, securing mountain passes and eliminating potential threats. Another moved through the south, cutting off routes toward the Persian Gulf. The central column, led by Hulagu himself, advanced directly toward Baghdad. Cities along the way faced the same choice. Some surrendered immediately. Their gates opened. Their rulers knelt. They lived. Others hesitated. They did not hesitate long. Baghdad received envoys. Messages were exchanged. Words were chosen carefully. Gifts were sent. Flattery filled letters. No clear submission was offered. No clear resistance declared. The Caliph believed ambiguity could buy time to the Mongols. Ambiguity meant refusal. As the months passed, the Mongol army closed the distance. Scouts appeared on the edges of the Abbasid world. Refugees followed. Behind them, traders arrived with stories that grew darker with each telling. Entire cities emptied. Fields lay untended. Roads filled with people carrying what little they could. Inside Baghdad, life continued. Scholars still debated. Markets still opened. The Caliph still trusted that his city's importance would shield it. He had lived his entire life inside a system that had always adjusted, always endured. He believed it would do so again. He did not understand that the Mongols were not another crisis. They were an ending by the time Hulagu crossed the Zagros Mountains. The last chance to change Baghdad's fate had already passed. The army was too large to stop. The alliances too weak to matter. The walls too old to resist the machines that now faced them. The river still flowed. The domes still shone. The library still stood, but beyond the horizon, the force that would reduce them to memory was already in motion. And it did not negotiate with symbols. It negotiated only with surrender. By the time that Mongol columns closed in, there was no longer any question of if the siege would happen, only how long it would take. Scouts reached the outskirts first. They did not attack. They watched. They counted gates. They measured distances. They marked the weakest sections of wall and the narrowest approaches. Nothing about them felt hurried. That calm frightened those who understood what it meant. Inside Baghdad, panic arrived unevenly. The poor felt it first. Food prices crept upward. Grain merchants began hiding supplies. Families whispered about escape routes, about boats, about roads that might still be open. The wealthy followed later, moving gold and jewelry into hidden rooms. Burying what they could not carry, the palace remained composed. Advisors still spoke in careful language. Letters were still drafted with courtesy. The Caliph still hoped that a final negotiation might soften what was coming. No order went out to fully strip the countryside of supplies. No emergency alliances were formed. No decisive stand was chosen. The Mongols completed their encirclement in silence. From the hills and plains surrounding the city, camps appeared, thousands of fires at night, stretching beyond the horizon. From the walls, it looked as though the stars had fallen to earth and ringed Baghdad in light. Then the engineers went to work. Trebuchets rose piece by piece, assembled with practiced speed. Their arms towered above the siege lines, angled precisely, calibrated by men who treated physics as routine. Stones were hauled into position, some weighing more than a man could lift. Incendiary projectiles were stacked nearby, sealed in clay. Inside the city, defenders watched and understood this was not a blockade meant to starve. This was a countdown. The first stone flew just after dawn. It did not strike randomly. It hit exactly where the engineers had planned. The impact echoed through the city. Like thunder, dust leaped from the walls. Birds scattered from rooftops, then another, then another. By midday, the sound never stopped. Stone after stone arced over the walls, crashing into fortifications and neighborhoods alike. The bombardment did not pause for prayers. It did not slow at night. Firepots followed the stones, shattering into flames that crawled across rooftops and market stalls. Baghdad had never experienced war like this. Sieges before had been patient. Affairs, waiting, bargaining, watching. This was mechanical, impersonal. The machines did not tire. The crews rotated in shifts. Calculations replaced courage. Repair crews rushed to damaged sections under cover of darkness. The Mongols answered with fire. Silhouettes against flame became targets. By the second night, the repairs slowed. By the third, they stopped. Inside the city, fear began to change shape. At first, people hid in their homes. Then they moved closer, together. Then they fled inward, away from the walls, only to learn that stones did not respect distance. Entire families vanished beneath collapsed roofs. Fire spread faster than anyone could contain. The river reflected smoke instead of stars. On the walls, defenders fought with the knowledge that every man lost could not be replaced. The Mongols could afford casualties. Baghdad could not. Each breach widened. Each crack lengthened. After days of relentless bombardment, the southeastern wall failed. It did not explode. It slumped. Stone gave way under accumulated damage, collapsing into a ramp of rubble. Mongol assault troops poured forward immediately. Shields raised, arrows darkening the air. The defenders met them with everything they had: boiling oil, rocks, blades, desperation. For a moment, the city held. Bodies piled in the breach. The street beyond ran red. The fighting was so close that arrows were useless. Men stabbed, clawed, and dragged each other down into the rubble. The Mongols pulled back before nightfall, leaving their dead where they fell. Inside Baghdad, people dared to hope. That hope lasted one night. The trebuchets shifted aim. New sections of wall began to crumble. Fires spread unchecked. The defenders were stretched thin, running from breach to breach. There were no reserves left to call. The mathematics of the siege were no longer in doubt. When the Caliph finally sent envoys to submit, the message arrived too late. The Mongols had already paid in blood. Cities that resisted and then surrendered did not receive mercy. The gates opened not for negotiation, but for humiliation. On the morning he walked out, the Caliph wore black, the color of his dynasty. He carried no weapon. He walked past the ruins of his city toward the man who had come to erase it. Behind him waited 1 million people, who still believed surrender meant survival. They would learn the truth in days, not years. Because the Mongols had not come to rule Baghdad, they had come to end it. The gates of Baghdad opened in silence. There was no trumpet, no proclamation, just the sound of wood and iron giving way, and a slow procession stepping out into the plain. At the front walked the Caliph. Behind him came his sons, his brothers, judges, scholars. Officials, men who had never imagined leaving the city like this, on foot, unarmed. Watched by enemies who did not bow, across the field waited Hulagu Khan. He did not rise. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He received the Caliph with calm courtesy, offered water, asked questions in a measured voice. He wanted lists where the gold was kept, where the silver was hidden. Which officials knew the vaults, which palaces stored reserves. The Caliph answered everything. Cooperation, he believed, was still a currency. Orders followed quietly. The population was told to leave the city. Everyone, men, women, children, they were instructed to carry nothing. They were assured that obedience would be rewarded with safety. Soldiers lined the roads, guiding the crowds outward. People obeyed because hope is stubborn. Outside the walls, the crowds were separated. Christians were escorted away under guard. Jews were gathered nearby. The rest, overwhelmingly Muslim, were herded into open fields, organized by district, by street, by neighborhood. Families clutched each other, waiting for the next instruction. It came without ceremony. The killing began on February 13th. There was no battle. There was no resistance. The Mongols moved through the assembled crowds methodically, as if harvesting grain. Units worked in shifts to avoid exhaustion. Blades rose and fell. Arrows were loosed at close range. Clubs finished what swords did not. Men fell first, then women, then children. The ground darkened. The air filled with screaming, then with silence. Bodies piled faster than they could be moved. The fields outside the city became slaughterhouses. stretching beyond sight inside Baghdad. Another destruction unfolded. Soldiers poured through the streets, stripping palaces, mosques, homes. Anything of value was taken. Anything too heavy was smashed. Workshops were gutted, markets burned. Houses collapsed into smoke and ash. The river became a carrier of death. Bodies were thrown into the Tigris River, clogging its banks, drifting downstream for miles. Fishermen days later would find corpses tangled in reeds far from the city. The water grew foul. No one dared drink from it. Some resisted. A small group of soldiers barricaded themselves in the military quarter. They fought until arrows ran out, until swords broke, until hands bled. They were killed where they stood. Their stand changed nothing, except the number of dead. The caliph remained alive through the first days of slaughter. Hulagu kept him close, extracting the last details of hidden wealth. When there was nothing left to give, nothing left to say, the caliph's usefulness ended. He was wrapped in a carpet. Mongol horses were driven over him until his body broke beneath their hooves. His sons were killed the same way. The dynasty that had ruled for 5 centuries ended in minutes. Without witnesses who could protest, the killing continued for a week. Numbers lost meaning. Some spoke of hundreds of thousands dead. Others said 1 million. No one counted. There was no reason to. When the soldiers finally stopped, Baghdad was no longer a city. It was a field of corpses bordered by ruins. Then the books burned. The soldiers who entered the libraries were not looking for knowledge. They were looking for shelter, for fuel, for space. Shelves were overturned. Manuscripts were thrown aside. Paper piled high in courtyards and halls. Someone set it alight. Flames climbed. Through centuries of work, ink boiled, pages curled and vanished. Books were carried to the river and dumped by the cartload, clogging the water until it ran dark with ink. Some said you could walk across the surface on soaked pages. Whether true or not, the image spread, because it felt right. The House of Wisdom disappeared in smoke and water when the fires finally died. There was nothing left to save. The siege had lasted days. The destruction would last. Generations. Hulagu ordered his army to camp outside the city. The streets were too polluted with death to occupy. Even the conquerors recoiled from what they had made. Behind them lay a silence so complete it felt unnatural. A city that had once argued, studied, traded, and dreamed was gone. And the world would feel that absence long after the blood had washed away. When the killing stopped, Baghdad did not feel conquered. It felt abandoned. Smoke hung low over the ruins, trapped beneath a winter sky. Fires still smoldered where no one remained to put them out. Dogs moved through the streets in packs, feeding freely. Rats nested in collapsed houses that had once held scholars, merchants, children. The sound that replaced the city's constant noise was the sound of wind passing through broken stone. Those who survived crept back cautiously. They moved like thieves in their own home, stepping around bodies that had not yet been buried because there was no one left to bury them. Wells were poisoned by rot. Food stores had been looted or burned. The river could not be trusted. Disease followed hunger the way night follows dusk. For weeks, death continued without swords, cholera, dysentery, fever. Survivors who had escaped. The massacre collapsed in alleys and died quietly, unnoticed. Entire families vanished without a witness to record their names. The irrigation system that had sustained Mesopotamia for centuries lay shattered. Canals were broken, dams were destroyed. Fields that had fed 1 million people flooded into swamps or dried into dust. The land itself began to rebel against human presence. Hulagu did not rebuild. He had no reason to. The Mongol army had taken everything of value. Gold and silver moved east in caravans. Skilled artisans were selected and sent away. What remained was a liability, not a prize. A small garrison was left behind, enough to prevent rebellion, not enough to restore life. Baghdad had been reduced from the center of the world to a warning. Travelers approaching months later reported the smell before they saw the walls. Horses refused to advance. Men covered their faces and retched. The city announced its fate long before it came into view. The population collapsed. From more than 1 million souls, it fell to a fraction of that number. No census recorded it. No authority remained to care. The survivors scattered to Damascus, to Cairo, two distant courts that might still value learning. Scholars arrived elsewhere with nothing but fragments in their memory. Books they had meant to copy someday were gone. Notes they had planned to finish were ash. Entire fields of inquiry ended not with debate, but with silence. The world adjusted. It always does. Egypt became the new center of power. Cairo absorbed some of what Baghdad had lost, but not all. Institutions survived, but the scale was different. The confidence was different. The idea that knowledge would always be protected had been shattered across the Islamic world. Rulers drew lessons, often the wrong ones. Some concluded that learning had not saved Baghdad, so learning must be dangerous. Others decided that strong rule mattered more than inquiry. Funding shifted. Curiosity narrowed. Debate grew cautious. The loss was not immediate, but it was real. The Mongols did not remain forever. Empires built on speed eventually slow. Hulagu died within a decade. His successors ruled from Persia, adopting the language and faith of the people they had conquered. They built mosques. They patronized scholars. But what had burned did not return. Libraries cannot be resurrected by regret. Manuscripts dumped into rivers do not rise again. Networks of teachers and students, once broken, do not reassemble themselves. Centuries passed. Baghdad would be destroyed again by other conquerors, other wars. Each time it tried to recover, another wound reopened. The city never reclaimed its old role. The world moved on, carrying fragments of its legacy without knowing their source. Today, numbers can be recited, dates memorized, names listed. But none of that captures what was lost. A civilization does not die when its buildings fall. It dies when the conversations stop, when questions go unasked, when answers are no longer recorded. In February 1258, that silence began, and it echoed far beyond the ruins on the Idris. The news traveled faster than anyone expected. Messengers rode day and night. Refugees carried fragments of the story along trade routes. By the time the truth reached Damascus, no one could pretend it was rumor anymore. Baghdad was gone. The caliph was dead. The libraries were ash. The river itself had carried the evidence downstream. People wailed in the streets, not for a city they had seen, but for a center they had always assumed existed. For 5 centuries, Baghdad had anchored the world. Now the anchor had snapped. Some believed the end times had begun. Scholars whispered of Gog and Magog. Preachers searched scripture for explanations. Ordinary people did what humans always do when meaning collapses. They looked for patterns, for blame, for signs that suffering was not random. Rulers reacted differently. In Syria, hesitation proved fatal. Diplomacy was attempted, then flight, then resistance, too late and too divided. Cities opened their gates and survived briefly. Others resisted and were erased. The Mongol advance felt unstoppable, a tide that learned nothing from victory, because it did not need to. Only Egypt stood intact. Across the desert, in Cairo, the rulers of the Mamluk Sultanate understood something Baghdad had not. Delay was death. They did not have the luxury of symbols. Their power came from soldiers, and soldiers could be used. When Mongol envoys arrived demanding submission, they were executed. Their heads were displayed on the gates. There would be no negotiation, no gifts, no waiting. The decision was not heroic. It was desperate. In the summer of 1260, two forces met in a valley in Palestine called Anjalut. The Mongols had never lost a major battle. Their reputation alone had broken empires. But this time, something different happened. The Mamluks used the Mongols' own tactics against them. A feigned retreat drew the Mongol cavalry into broken ground. Hidden forces struck from the flanks. The rhythm the Mongols had imposed on the world turned against them. For the first time in decades, a Mongol army broke. The victory did not undo Baghdad. The books did not return. The dead did not rise. The caliphate did not reappear. But the myth of inevitability cracked. The Mongols could be stopped. Egypt survived. Syria partially recovered. The advance westward slowed, then stalled. The terror that had swept across Asia found its boundary. Yet, even in victory, the world Baghdad had shaped did not return. Cairo became powerful. Damascus remained important, but neither became what Baghdad had been. The scale was smaller. The ambition narrower. Knowledge continued, but cautiously. The confidence that learning itself was a form of strength had been shaken. Centuries later, Europe would rise. It would rediscover Aristotle through Arabic translations. It would learn algebra from texts that traced their lineage to Baghdad. It would navigate by stars named by scholars who once worked along the Tigris. The Renaissance would bloom, using seeds preserved by a civilization already destroyed. Baghdad would remain a ghost in memory. Travelers passing through its ruins, centuries later, wrote of broken walls half buried in sand, of a city that once held the world and now barely held itself. No monument marked where the House of Wisdom had stood. Scholars argued about its location because nothing remained to identify it. Absence became the evidence. Empires rose and fell. The Mongols themselves fragmented, absorbed by the cultures they had conquered. Hulag's descendants became Muslim. They built mosques. They patronized poetry. History moved on. But what was erased stayed erased. You can rebuild walls. You can repopulate streets. You can rename capitals. What you cannot rebuild is a conversation interrupted mid-sentence and burned. Baghdad's fall was not just a defeat. It was a subtraction from humanity's future. The world learned to live without it, and in doing so, became something else entirely. Time did what conquest never could. It moved forward. The Mongols faded into history faster than anyone in 1258 could have imagined. Hulagu was dead within a decade. His empire fractured into smaller states. His descendants adopted the languages, religions, and customs of the people they had once destroyed. The conquerors dissolved into the conquered, but Baghdad did not recover. With them, for centuries, it remained a shadow of itself. A provincial city passed between empires. Ottomans, Persians, local rulers, each controlled it briefly. None restored it fully. The irrigation canals stayed broken. The trade routes shifted. Scholars stopped coming. What had been lost was not just buildings or population. It was momentum. Before 1258, learning in the Islamic world had been confident. Scholars argued with the past instead of obeying it. They tested, revised, corrected. Knowledge moved forward because questioning was expected. After Baghdad, that rhythm slowed. Institutions elsewhere survived, but they grew cautious. Funding narrowed. Debate tightened. The idea that knowledge alone could protect a civilization no longer felt true. Libraries did not stop existing, but they stopped expanding in the same fearless way. The loss echoed quietly in Europe. Something else was happening. Centuries after Baghdad burned, European scholars began rediscovering ancient knowledge. Aristotle returned. Galen reappeared. Algebra arrived. Star charts were corrected. Much of it came through Arabic text translations, commentaries, expansions produced in cities that no longer existed in their original form. Europe did not inherit Baghdad. It inherited fragments of it, enough to ignite a transformation. Not enough to replace what had been erased. The Renaissance blossomed 200 years after the sack. It felt like a rebirth because Europe had forgotten that the flame had never fully gone out. It had simply been burning somewhere else, until that place was destroyed. History rarely feels irony, but this one cuts deep. The civilization that preserved ancient knowledge, expanded it, refined it, and handed it forward was destroyed before it could complete its own trajectory. Others would rise using its foundations, unaware of the rooms that had once stood above them. Baghdad became a cautionary memory when later generations spoke of decline. They pointed back to 1258. When unity fractured, scholars invoked the caliph, who waited too long. When libraries burned again in later wars. In modern times, the comparison returned instinctively. Some wounds become symbols. The city itself eventually grew again. Modern Baghdad would reach millions once more. Cars replaced caravans, concrete replaced brick, satellites replaced astrolabes. Life returned, because life always does, but no city would ever again hold humanity's knowledge in one place. That era ended in smoke. Perhaps that is the final legacy. Not just loss, but dispersion, knowledge learned to scatter so it could never be burned all at once again. The price of that lesson was paid in blood, ink, and silence on the banks of the Tigris. And even now, centuries later, the absence still speaks. Centuries passed, and the world learned to live with the gap. Children grew up in cities that had never heard Baghdad argue with itself at midnight. Scholars debated using texts that ended abruptly, chapters missing, references pointing to books that no longer existed. They did not know what had been lost, only that something felt incomplete. Absence has a way of becoming normal. Travelers who reached Baghdad in later centuries found a city rebuilt just enough to function. Markets returned. Mosques reopened. Homes clustered where ruins had been cleared. But no one came looking for libraries that spanned continents. No one expected the city to explain the universe anymore. That role had vanished with the smoke. Poets remembered, though they wrote of a Baghdad that no longer existed, a city of lamps and arguments, of scholars who crossed faiths without fear, of nights when the future felt expandable. Their verses were mournful, not because the city was gone, but because what it represented felt unreachable, a memory of confidence. Across the Islamic world, story hardened into lesson. Unity mattered. Strength mattered. Obedience mattered. Curiosity became careful. Innovation became incremental. The risks that once felt worthwhile no longer did. None of this happened overnight. Civilizations do not collapse in a single moment, they tilt. Baghdad's fall did not end inquiry, but it bent it. The angle changed. Over time, that angle mattered. Europe, meanwhile, accelerated. Universities multiplied. Printing spread ideas faster than paper ever had. The scientific method, something practiced in Baghdad centuries earlier, was renamed, refined, and claimed as new. Telescopes replaced naked eye astronomy. Laboratories replaced courtyards. History rewarded whoever arrived last with better tools. But even as Europe rose, it did so standing on borrowed ground. Algebra carried Arabic names. Stars kept Arabic titles. Medical texts echoed voices from Cities that no longer spoke. The past lingered in language, even when the place that forged it had been erased. Baghdad itself endured more wounds. It was sacked again, ruled again, ignored again. Each century layered damage over damage. By the time modern empires arrived, little remained of the medieval city except memory and soil. Archaeologists searched for the House of Wisdom and argued over its location because nothing marked it. The greatest research institution of its age vanished so completely that even its footprint became uncertain. That may be the cruelest detail. Not that it burned, but that it left so little behind. The Tigris River kept flowing. It carried boats, commerce, children learning to swim. No plaque marked where ink once turned its waters dark. No monument rose to name what had drowned there. History does not always preserve what matters most. Sometimes it preserves only the outline of loss, and yet memory persists. Every time a library burns in war, every time a scholar is silenced, every time knowledge is treated as expendable, the shadow of Baghdad appears, whether named or not, because Baghdad was not destroyed by ignorance alone. It was destroyed by delay, by comfort, by the belief that what had always existed, always would. That belief is older than empires, and it has never been true. The river still flows. The Tigris River has carried empires on its surface and buried them beneath its mud. Boats cross it now. Children swim where ink once darkened the water. The city around it lives, argues, laughs, rebuilds. From a distance, nothing looks broken, but some absences do not announce themselves. They exist in the questions we still ask, in the discoveries that arrive later than they might have, in the ideas that feel unfinished. As if a sentence was cut short centuries ago. When Baghdad fell, it was not only walls that collapsed, a method collapsed. A belief collapsed. The belief that knowledge carefully gathered and fiercely protected could outlast violence simply by existing. It could not. The House of Wisdom was not destroyed because it was weak. It was destroyed because it was defenseless against indifference. The soldiers who burned its books did not hate learning. They did not fear it. They simply did not value it. And that was enough. Destruction does not always require malice. Sometimes it only requires neglect. History often asks, why? Baghdad did not fight harder, prepare earlier, choose differently. Those questions miss something quieter and more unsettling. Baghdad believed in continuity. It believed that 5 centuries of survival meant permanence, that the world it knew would still be there tomorrow. Every civilization believes this, until it is proven wrong. What was lost in February 1258 cannot be listed completely because loss erased its own inventory. We know fragments algebra refined too early, medicine practiced too precisely, astronomy measured too carefully for its time. We know there were manuscripts that existed only once. We know there were minds that died before their questions were finished. We do not know the rest, and that is the true cost. Not the books we can name, but the ones we never knew existed. Not the discoveries delayed, but the ones never made. The paths diverted, but the ones never taken at all. Civilization is not a line. It is a conversation across generations. Baghdad was one of the few places where that conversation spoke many languages at once, argued openly, corrected itself, and moved forward without asking permission from tradition. When that conversation was silenced, the world did not stop talking. It just spoke more carefully, more cautiously, more slowly. Centuries later, knowledge learned to scatter, to duplicate, to hide itself across borders and servers and languages so that no single fire could take it all again. That lesson came at a cost humanity has never finished paying. The Mongols are gone. The Abbasids are gone, Empires that replaced them are gone, but absence remains, somewhere beneath the streets of modern Baghdad. Beneath concrete and traffic and routine life lie atoms of paper that once carried answers. They will never be read. They will never be rewritten. They exist only as a reminder that progress is fragile and memory even more so. This is not a story about the past. It is a warning that keeps repeating, because libraries still burn, because scholars are still silenced, because comfort still convinces. Societies that tomorrow is guaranteed. Baghdad believed that too. For 500 years, it was right. For 13 days, it was catastrophically wrong. And the echo of that mistake still moves with the river, long after the ink and blood have washed away.